Hello, everyone. It's Steve with Aptera Owners Club. One of our viewers asked me to review this TED Talk by Graham Conway. It is a TED Talk called The Contradictions of Battery-Operated Vehicles by Graham Conway at TEDx San Antonio. This thing was published in January 31 of 2020, has 3 million views, so has quite a number of views. And I've seen this before in the press, and people have talked about it on social media, and I think it's gotten a lot of traction. Um, and I kind of wanted to talk about it mainly because I have an interest in this kind of stuff, because I think one of the biggest problems in the world today, or one of the problems that I see, is that there's so much information out there, and all of it sounds credible, and it's very hard for people to tell like what's good information and what's not, and how to assess whether information is factual or not. Some of this is unavoidable because the world has become so complex that without a certain amount of expertise, it's very hard to parse out what's reality and what is good data and what is bad data, and how do you figure out what's good data and what's bad data. And like facts are not what people believe. Like when we're in high school science class, we're taught like science is a set of facts. However, science is not a set of facts. Science is a methodology, and facts are like what people find in experiments under certain conditions. So depending on the conditions of the experiment and the methodology, you may get a different set of, quote, facts. So anyways, we'll kind of delve into the philosophy of it a little bit, but let's go over this TED Talk for those of you that are interested, and I'm sure many of you are not interested, so you can skip this one. It'll be kind of a long one. I'm going to ramble a lot. But this is talking about the contradictions of battery-operated vehicles. So let's listen. I'll pause intermittently to comment on it.
Climate change is a hoax, and the electric vehicle is an abomination. Someone once told me that to capture an audience's attention, you need to offend them. And what better way to offend people than to denounce climate change? Because if there's one thing the world may unanimously agree upon, is that we'd all like it to be here in the future. So now that I have your attention, let me revisit those opening comments. I do actually believe in climate change, but I do have a problem with the way we define electric vehicles. So this talk will still offend some people. I can almost see the YouTube comments on this video now. It isn't pretty. But this talk is not about demonizing the electric vehicle unfairly. I absolutely believe they are the future of personal transportation. They do a fantastic job at moving pollution out of densely populated cities. They're fun to drive, and you can get free parking too sometimes. And I know this because I owned an electric vehicle for 3 years, and it was a great car. There will absolutely be a place for the electric vehicle in our future, but not today. Let me start with a question. There are 1 billion passenger cars on the world's roads today. If I gave you a button which would turn them all into electric vehicles, would you push it? The problem of climate change is a global one. It is believed to be caused by increasing CO2 concentrations in our atmosphere. If you put a box around the Earth and measured the gases trapped inside that box, you would indeed find CO2, and that CO2 levels are rising. What is causing CO2 levels to rise? Well, one source is the cars and trucks that we drive. These emit CO2 from the tailpipe, and the way the industry currently measures this CO2 is like putting a special box around the vehicle and measuring what's inside the box. Society's solution to the problem is the electric vehicle. Because if you put a box around the electric vehicle and try and measure CO2, you won't find any. So based on this way of measuring CO2, we've decided to call these zero emissions, or we call these dirty. But let me show you why this is wrong. Consider that instead of changing all vehicles into electric vehicles, we instead change them into horses. Now, a horse breathes in air and it breathes out CO2. So if you put a box around the horse, you would measure CO2. If you rode that horse the same distance as you drove the car, you would find something quite shocking. The horse emits as much CO2 as a Corvette.
Okay, I want to pause it here. First of all, I think he started this talk really well. He, comes up with a very controversial statement which gets everyone's attention, and then he talks about electric cars and the pros of them and how he believes in them. So it's very disarming. So I think he does a great job. Conway works for a think tank that's funded by Tom Stiles, who's an oil magnate, and so it's not an unbiased opinion, but I think we should go away from the idea that it's because something comes from a certain source, we can just discount it. I don't think that's the way to analyze data. You should analyze the data on its own merits. And if they're saying the truth, it doesn't matter what background they are or what bias they may have personally, because everyone has biases. And so we have to analyze what things people say on their own merits. Okay, so this is the first statement which he said that made me kind of think, well, that doesn't quite pass the sniff test. A horse emits the same amount of CO2 as a Corvette per mile. I just thought about, just like if you think about it logically, that just doesn't make sense. A Corvette is what, like 5,000 pounds? And a horse is like 1,000 pounds. So you're moving 5 times the amount of mass and creating the same amount, using the same amount of energy, because they both the horse and the Corvette burn carbon sources as fuel. The horse burns glucose, and the Corvette burns gasoline. Those are both carbon sources that get oxidized and get turned into CO2. All right. So the Corvette is 5,000 pounds, and the horse is about a little over 1,000 pounds on average. And they're saying that the horse generates as much CO2 as moving a mass that's 5 times as massive. Now, understandably, wheels are a lot more efficient than legs. But I don't think they're 5 times more efficient. And also, I know that internal combustion engines generate a tremendous amount of heat waste. And so they're only about 30% efficient in turning chemical energy into mechanical energy. The other 70% gets burned off as thermal waste energy. Oxidative phosphorylation in animals, that's the process by which glucose is turned into ATP, and ATP runs the muscles. That's very efficient thermally, actually. So I know that the energy conversion process in an animal, the biochemistry behind it is very efficient, whereas legs and muscles and joints probably not as efficient as axles and drivetrains and wheels. But it just didn't make sense to me that moving a 1,000 pounds of mass with a highly efficient chemical energy system is less efficient than, or the same efficiency as moving 5 times the amount of mass with a very thermally inefficient engine, despite the drivetrain being more efficient. So I kind of looked it up, and I found out that this website about horses, so I went to some like equestrian websites, this says a horse burns about 2,000 calories if it walks for 2 hours. And then a horse walking, the walking speed of a horse is about 4 miles per hour. So if a horse walks for 2 hours, it's going 8 miles. So you've gone about 8 miles in 2 hours, and so you burn 2,000 calories to go 8 miles. All right. If you look at how much carbon dioxide an animal, and this time it's using a person, but a person, we use the same oxidative phosphorylation system as a horse. When a person burns 2,000 calories, they generate about 0.7 kilograms of carbon dioxide, or 700 grams of carbon dioxide. So let's look at this. The horse has gone 8 miles for 2,000 calories. 2,000 calories is 700 grams. So that's 700 grams, and it's gone 8 miles. That's 87.5 grams of carbon dioxide per mile. Okay, so just remember that number, 87 point. So horse burns 87.5 grams of CO2 per mile. Now, how much does the average car burn per mile? Okay, so there's two. I found two different sources for it. This one is looking at cars in the United Kingdom, and remember, cars in the United Kingdom are smaller cars, and they drive slower. So they're burning less energy, because driving slower uses less energy, and smaller cars use less energy. So if you look at cars in the UK, grams per mile, I mean, these cars are getting more efficient over time, which makes sense. So back in 2007, it was almost 300 grams per mile. But in 2020, it's 221 grams per mile. So remember, the horse, 87.5 grams per mile. The average car in the UK, 221 grams per mile. Then if you look at the United States, much bigger cars on average. We have a lot of trucks and SUVs, and we drive faster in the US. And so in the US, that's 400 grams per mile, so almost twice as much. So 400 grams of CO2 per mile, right? So number one, that number does not make sense. So a Corvette is probably more than the average passenger vehicle, so it's probably more than 400 grams per mile, and the horse is 87.5 grams per mile. So this is not on its face correct. Now, I do believe that he's not lying. I believe he's not lying, because I think what they're doing is they're saying that basically the horse, on a per day basis, is going to burn a lot of calories, because you're not riding the horse all the time, and the horse has got to be fed even when you're not riding it. So let's say that you ride a horse and ride it 2 hours per day, and the rest of the day it's not working. So you ride a horse 2 hours per day, and so that's 2,000 calories that you walked it 2 hours a day. But the horse will need about 20,000 calories a day just to live. You have to feed the horse 20,000. Whereas when the car's not running, it's burning zero fuel. It's not making any calories. So if you make this double, so instead of 2,000 calories, it's 20,000 calories, then you multiply this times 10. Yeah, now you have this horse makes 875 grams of CO2 per mile, as opposed to 400 grams per mile for the average passenger car, which the Corvette would be more than that. So then you could say, well, horse, on average throughout its lifespan, if you ride it 2 to 3 hours a day, which seems to be a reasonable use for a horse, it's gonna put out the same amount of CO2 as the Corvette. And so that's how you can kind of make things. It's not untrue if you look at it a certain way. So if you look at how many calories does the horse actually use when it's going that extra mile on top of its basal metabolic rate, it's far less than a Corvette, which just makes sense intuitively, because it's a much lighter, smaller amount of mass, which a much more efficient chemical and energy conversion system than the car. But if you take into account like all the feed you have to feed it while it's alive for the rest of the day when you're not riding it, well then yeah, it will generate as much CO2 as a Corvette. Okay, so anyways, I just want to talk about that because it's kind of a silly thing he says, but you can see how you can say things that are not untrue but can be kind of misleading.
So you can see, based on this way of measuring CO2, our only possible conclusion is that if we changed all cars into horses, we would be emitting as much CO2 as 1 billion Corvettes. And that doesn't sound very good for the environment, does it? But as you sit there, I'm sure something deep inside of you is saying, that doesn't sound right.
Yeah, and that didn't sound right to me, but not for the reason he's about to say.
And you'd be correct. Of course, if we changed all cars into horses, our climate would be better. And here's why it would be better. You see, even though the horse breathes out CO2 into the atmosphere, that CO2 is then absorbed by plants and converted back into oxygen, which the horse breathes in again. And so you see the CO2 is in a cycle. And because it is in a cycle, it doesn't increase. In contrast, the car is different. Because with the car, we dig oil out of the ground, we burn it, and we produce CO2. And it isn't in a cycle, so it is increasing.
I mean, so that is very true. Like, that's the problem with fossil fuels. Fossil fuels are a one-way street. Now, this is not a perfectly circular system. And of course, if we had 1 billion horses, we would have so much manure, we wouldn't be able to deal with it. And they would also generate methane. Now, cows generate way more methane than horses, and methane is a much stronger greenhouse gas than CO2.
So you were right to be skeptical. But based on how we currently measure CO2, you could not possibly have come to this conclusion without doing this type of analysis. Let's go back to the electric vehicle. Remember, the way we quantify CO2 is to measure it from the tailpipe. But the electric car doesn't burn fuel, but it does use electricity. So we have to look at where that comes from. A large proportion of our electricity comes from coal. Now, we dig coal out of the ground in large quantities. We then burn it in power stations, which produces CO2. You can see there is no arrow along the top of this diagram. That CO2 is not in a cycle, and it is increasing.
Okay, so I wanted to go back to that. He says a large portion of our electricity comes from burning coal. That's true on a global scale. On a global scale, like places like China and India still use a ton of coal. In the United States, coal, I think, is less than 20% of our energy production. Natural gas is much higher, which is a much cleaner source in terms of CO2 production. In the UK, it's even less than the United States. And different parts of the country use different energy mixes. Like if you live in the Pacific Northwest, it's a lot of hydroelectric. There's I think essentially zero coal in the Pacific Northwest. In California, it's very little coal, probably less than 10%. Much more coal out kind of like West Virginia, Pennsylvania, Ohio, that area. So it depends on which part of the world and which part of the country, what your mix is. But in developed countries, coal is a minor contributor to electric production. In developing countries, or I guess I wouldn't say that China is a developing country. I guess in some ways it is, but like China uses a lot of coal, India uses a lot of coal. Globally, coal is probably about 60% of the electric power generation mix. In the Western countries and more developed countries, it is a minority player.
But you couldn't possibly know this by only measuring the vehicle's tailpipe. What we need to do is expand our imaginary box to include everything.
I mean, so that's like we all understand, intuitively know this. Like the electricity doesn't come for free. You have to get it from someplace. And depending on how you're getting it, you may be generating CO2. The other thing to think about is when cars generate CO2, car internal combustion engines have to work through a large torque band, and they have to work through some parts of their cycle that are less efficient to make the car go. When you run a power plant, you can tune the engine of a power plant to be at its most efficient speed and its most efficient cycle. And so you will get better efficiency out of a power plant even though you're burning the same fuel. So if you had a power plant burning gasoline, it would be more thermally efficient than the internal combustion engine in a car, because the car engine has different demands on it than a power plant engine.
And coal isn't the only way we generate electricity. We also burn natural gas and we burn oil. These two produce CO2. Now, you might be sitting there and saying, hang on a minute, I charge my electric vehicle from solar panels on my roof. So that's okay, right? Well, for you, maybe. And many developed nations are moving away from coal and natural gas to renewable energy sources. But CO2 is a global problem. So let's have a look at things on a global scale. How much of the world's electricity is produced by burning fuel which creates CO2? It's about 2/3.
Okay, so this is outdated information. It's about 10 years old. It's actually like 62% or 61% coal now, CO2 generating.
So you can see when you plug your electric vehicle in, you are probably producing.
Oh, and in California, during the day, in most of the summer, this green part is 100%. It's almost all solar. The energy mix in California. We talked about that in a video a few days ago, but the energy mix is changing. It is rapidly changing, so that this is getting better.
CO2, it just isn't being measured. You see, the automotive industry has cleverly found a way to move the problem, not solve the problem. But is the electric vehicle really worse? Well, to understand if it's worse, we need to look at how much emissions are produced during the life of the vehicle. The average age of a vehicle before it gets scrapped is around 180,000 miles. You can see the conventional vehicle produces about 30 tons of CO2 over its lifetime.
Okay, let's do the math on that. Okay, that's 27,200 kilograms. All right, so let's look at that. 27,215. Oops. 27,215 kilograms divided by 180,000 miles. All right, so he's saying that this theoretic car produces 151 grams per mile traveled. As you can see from our previous things, that is a rather an optimistic amount. If you look at this, you'll see that the average car in the UK is producing 221, not 115. So 221, not 115. And the average car in the United States is 400 grams per mile, not 151. Okay, so 151. I imagine that he's quoting the number from like a Prius, like that is like the most efficient gas burning car you could find. Then yes, you might get 151. So there is some cherry picking of data here. So I don't think this is outright untrue, but definitely picking definitely picking a value that makes his argument look better. Okay, so remember, if you're picking the average car in the United States, it's 3 times as high as this. And the average car in the UK is about 20% higher than this, maybe 30%, 30% higher than this.
How does the electric vehicle look? Pretty good, right? Because some of...
All right, so this is the crux of his talk, is these graphs. So we're going to go over these graphs. So he's saying that a conventional vehicle is going to produce 30 tons over 180 miles. Now, we know that that's a very optimistic slope, right? In the United States, that's the conventional car is going to be 3 times that. So this number should be 60. So the slope should look more like this. Okay, and then this slope for the electric car is based on a carbon mix where he's saying that you're going to use the global carbon mix, which uses some outdated, a little bit outdated data. It's a little about 10 years old, which says 67% uses CO2. So if you're in the UK or the United States, this slope will be less than half of that. All right, so that's very important to understand.
That electricity comes from renewable sources, and because the electric motor is far more efficient than the internal combustion engine, it produces less CO2. But there is a problem with this graph. This graph says that at 0 miles, 0 CO2 has been produced. And if you think about that for a second, it means that the two cars have magically appeared in the showroom out of thin air. In reality, a huge amount of CO2 is produced just making a vehicle, because you have to dig raw materials out of the ground, transport them to factories where they can be formed into car parts before finally being assembled into vehicles. Each step requires energy, and so we create CO2. So you can see the conventional vehicle comes to the showroom having generated about 6 tons of CO2. And now this is the critical part. Making a battery isn't easy. The materials required are harder to find, and making a battery cell requires a huge amount of energy. So the battery vehicle comes to the showroom having generated about 12 tons of CO2. And you can see you'd have to drive it around 80 or 90,000 miles before you offset that CO2 penalty.
All right. So he's making the assumption that the battery of this electric car uses double, so produces 6 tons of CO2 at its creation. And remember, these slopes are unrealistic. This slope should be much steeper, like this. And in fact, it should be even steeper than that, because there's this, what you don't take into account is he's taking into account the total cost of production of electricity, however, only measuring the tailpipe CO2 production of a gas vehicle. You have to understand that creating gasoline also is expensive. You have to prospect for oil, drill for oil, extract the oil, transport the oil, refine the oil, and then transport the gasoline. So if you do all that, they said you have to, this study said you have to add about 30% for gasoline and 24% for diesel. So if the average car in Great Britain is 221, you have to add 30% to that. Or in the United States is 440 grams of CO2, you have to add 30% to that. So if you add 30% to this, it just makes it like 550 or something like that. So 550 is basically 4 times this much. And if you do that, this graph should top out not at 36, but at like 120. So this slope should be like this. So you can't like make the box bigger for the electric car and then keep the box the same for the conventional car, because there are energy costs to extracting and purifying gasoline as well. And then he picks a number for this graph that is unrealistic unless everyone is driving a Prius. So even if you were driving the average car in the UK, that slope would be like this. You know, it'd probably be up to like 60, because you're adding 30%, and it's 20. It was 221 versus 150, and so the slope's going to be much higher. And then the electric mix is going to be lower. So that crossover point in this situation will probably be below 40,000 miles.
But it is better in the end. So the electric vehicle still looks good here as well, right? Well, this is where it gets interesting. You see, the conventional vehicle has a 400-mile range, while the electric vehicle in this example has a 125-mile range. Now, 125 miles might be enough for some of you, but most of us want more. We'd like to be able to drive great distances across the states. Or if you're here in Texas, you might just want to get to the next city. So really, we need to be comparing a 400-mile range electric vehicle. And as you may have guessed, a longer range requires a larger battery, which means a larger CO2 penalty. And now you start to see the problem.
All right. So this is kind of the money shot for him. So number one, I think as people that most of us are interested in the Aptera, this 120-mile range battery in an Aptera would be the 400-mile would be a 400-mile Aptera, because the Aptera is about 3 times more efficient than the average electric car. So this is this electric car with a 125-mile range probably has a 40 kilowatt battery, but the 40 kilowatt battery in an Aptera will go 400 miles. This 400-mile range battery this 400-mile range electric car is about like an 80, 90 kilowatt hour battery or 100 kilowatt hour battery. And so that's going to take a lot of electricity. But how much electricity does it take? And we know that it generates a lot of electricity because mining raw materials like lithium, cobalt, nickel is labor intensive, and then they have to dry it and refine it and to manufacture batteries for it. It takes a lot of CO2. So if you look at this, it says a Tesla Model 3 with an 80 kilowatt hour lithium ion battery. That's a close to 400-mile range car, roughly. It's like 300 and something. Emissions for manufacturing that battery would range between 2,400 kilograms and 16,000 kilograms. So you see there's a huge range here. And what accounts for that huge range? So if you look at this thing, and you know what? One of the things that you have to say is when you try to decide who you're going to believe, it's important to look at the sources. And this guy, unfortunately, in TED Talks, you don't cite sources. He didn't put them in the description or anything. So you don't know what sources he's getting this from. I'll put all the sources in the description of this video. But if you look at this, they looked at several different studies and they show how much CO2 they're producing per kilowatt hour of battery production. And you can see this range is huge. It ranges from like 30 to 500. That's a range of greater than 1 order of magnitude. And that has to deal with the methodology of these papers, the way that they measured it, and also what energy source they were using. So like in this thing, there assumes manufacturing grid representative of East Asia. So basically they're using a Chinese manufacturing grid. So that's a very dirty manufacturing grid, a lot of coal. And the battery chemistry makes a big difference. So they can go anywhere from 30 to 400. So if you look at this, the Tesla battery, let's see what 16 metric tons is. Okay, so 16,000 kilograms in tons. So because he's using imperial tons. So that is 17 tons. He's saying that this 400-mile battery is going to add, about 20 tons. So that's more than the upper range. So that this is saying 18 tons, he's saying 20 tons. So he's using the upper range of this scale. If you use the lower end of the scale, that's 2,400 kilograms. Let's see. That's 3 tons. So that would be right here. So the 400-mile electric range would be like 3 tons, so 9. So it would look like this. So you see how like if you cherry pick the data and you pick like the highest range you can find, you like look at all the studies that have ever been published and you take the highest range, then you're going to get a graph that looks similar to this. And then you use a unrealistic slope for the gas car. So you cherry pick all the data. You use the worst
over its expected lifetime.
You use the worst possible manufacturing situation for the electric battery. Then you use the best possible scenario for the gas car. And then you don't take into account any of the costs of producing the gasoline and delivering it to your tank. You get a slope like this. However, if you take the best case scenario for the electric car and you take into account all the costs of delivering the gas to your tank and use the average car in the United States, this slope will look ridiculously steep. This slope will look less steep and start down here. The crossover point will be at like 10,000 miles. So and the truth lies somewhere in between. It's definitely like this is an outlier for sure. Probably the 400-mile range probably looks more like this range. And then the slope is definitely going to be much steeper than this. Probably not 4 times steeper, but at least twice as steep. And this is going to be shallow, probably not twice as shallow, but at least half as shallow. And so this is going to be much shallower. All right, let's keep listening.
It has emitted more CO2 than the conventional vehicle. It has contributed more to climate change than the conventional vehicle, and that is the crux of the problem. It has produced more CO2, but we've measured none. And so society is happy to continue to call these zero emissions. But that is dangerous and unproductive. But there is something we can do today, using technology we have today, which will make a difference today. And that is to look at hybrids. Hybrids are far more efficient than conventional vehicles because at low speeds, where the engine is inefficient, the electric motor compensates and says, "Don't worry, engine, I've got this. You stay turned off until we need you." And critically, a hybrid has a small battery. So the initial CO2 penalty is similar to the conventional vehicle, while the end-of-life emissions are far lower. In fact, to offset the CO2 from the electric vehicle, you would need to drive it around 450,000 miles.
Okay, again, that is not true. That's only true if you're assuming the worst case scenario for the electric battery and the best case scenario for the ICE or the hybrid car. And if you don't make those assumptions, the graph looks totally different. The crossover point is probably at like 10,000 miles.
Before you offset that CO2.
So if you make the scenario the complete opposite, you assume the best case scenario for the electric and the worst case scenario for the ICE car, the crossover point is probably at like 10,000 miles. The actual crossover point probably is somewhere in between, probably at like 50,000 miles. That's assuming a 400-mile range traditional vehicle. Now, for the Aptera, it would be much, much less.
But again, I don't want to demonize the electric vehicle. I just don't think we should adopt them today based on the way we generate our electricity and the way we make our batteries. But how can we help the electric vehicle meet its potential? Well, we need to invest in making our electricity generation from renewable sources around the world, so that when we plug our electric cars in, we know there is no CO2 being generated.
I kind of want to go back and like talk about this a little bit too. So solar and wind, those are great, but we know that they have their own problems too. Like these turbines, they're huge. They're made out of fiberglass. They're very hard to deal with at end of life. They create a lot of waste. Same with solar panels. Solar panels are silicon, so they're not a very valuable raw material. It takes a tremendous amount of energy and labor to recycle these, so they're not being recycled. It's just not economically efficient to recycle these things. And so they don't create CO2 as a problem, but they create a lot of waste. So, the ideal situation obviously is that we use less stuff. This is not the magic answer to everything. Like once we get solar panels and wind things, we can't just like go spend all the energy we want. Using less is always better. Being more efficient is always better, which is why I love the Aptera philosophy. Just being more efficient is always better, and using less stuff is always better. Because technology is not going to magically fix all of our problems.
Plug our electric cars in, we know there is no CO2 being generated. We can do this by building solar and wind farms. If we did that, then you can see the difference we can make to the emissions created during the life of the vehicle.
So thing, this actually is like the curve that you would get it with an Aptera if you didn't charge it. It'd be flat. Now, the Aptera will have a little bit more embodied CO2 creation than the regular electric car because the solar panels, um, they need a little energy to be produced. So they're going to have a little bit more cost, but they're going to be flatter. And then Aptera with a smaller battery is going to be less because it just has a smaller battery. Um, this 400-mile range battery is going to be the 1,000-mile range battery, or probably like a 1,200-mile battery in an Aptera, which is, I think again is one of my reasons that I think that the use case scenario for a 1,000-mile Aptera is pretty thin. It requires a ton of CO2 and a lot of resources to generate the battery for a 1,000-mile Aptera. It is very efficient, but the battery for a 1,000-mile vehicle is going to be extremely huge, no matter how you cut it. And so you're gonna have a lot of embodied waste and CO2 generation. And it's not just the CO2 generation. We've had that other video about cobalt and nickel. It's toxic to water. It uses up water from people that live in the area. There's a lot of human rights problems with the way that it's being mined in the Congo and other places. And it's just, if we can use less of it, it's just better.
We can go further too. We can invest in new battery technologies, battery production techniques to help offset that initial CO2 penalty. And so you can see the potential of the electric vehicle. You can see what it could look like in the future. It's just as a society, we are trillions of dollars and decades away.
No, we're not trillions of dollars in decades. Maybe we're trillions of dollars and decades
achieving.
away from like being zero and zero. But right now, it's already pretty good.
This. But we will get there one day. But what we don't want to do today is mislead people into buying electric vehicles by falsely calling them zero emissions.
Yeah, that's true. They are not zero emissions, and I hope no one actually believes that. They're not zero emissions, and electric cars are not the panacea for all of our climate woes. Definitely not. And like I talked about, like solar and wind, that's not a magic bullet either. They have their own set of problems. I mean, the best thing to do is to use the least consumptive thing to do the job that we want to do, which is why I personally bike to work every day. I think the bicycle is kind of like the best thing. It uses your own energy, and in most people have excess calories. We're all a little bit overweight, and we could use the fitness, and so we're not using any extra energy. It's just energy we need to burn off anyway, and a bicycle does not take that much energy to produce, and it lasts a long time. My previous bicycle, I commuted for 15 years with it before I retired it, and then that's why the Aptera is a very efficient car, and it's perfect for that. It uses the least amount of energy to transport you and some stuff a long distance, and that's why I think it's important that like we don't think like just because a Hummer is an EV, that's just like the greatest thing. I mean, that thing is a behemoth. It's going to take a ton of energy to make that thing and the battery pack for that thing. So we need to use the right size tool for the job. And if the job is to, go get some stuff from the local grocery store that's a few miles away, a bicycle is probably the thing to do. If you want to go visit someone that's like 50, 60 miles away, an Aptera is probably the thing to use. If you need to transport things, well, you need a truck. So there are use cases for larger vehicles. Or if you need to transport 15 people someplace, yeah, you need a van. An Aptera is not going to do the job. A bicycle is not going to do the job. But yeah, he's right. You can't make the EV like as if it's some kind of savior of everything.
What we need to do instead is to continue to invest in the internal combustion engine. It hasn't met its maximum potential yet.
Yeah, I mean, it's real close. We've been refining that thing for decades. You may eke out maybe a few percentage points of efficiency out of it, but it's not suddenly going to become like 70% efficient, thermally efficient. You know, it's in the 30s and it's going to stay in the 30s.
And we can look into renewable fuels. This is where we combine water with the waste CO2 to create fuels for our vehicles. Now, there's a good reason we don't do this today. It requires a huge amount of energy to do this. But if all that energy comes from renewable sources, then it isn't a problem for the climate.
But it's a problem for the waste stream.
So you see, we've created a new CO2 cycle. And you can see how fantastic that looks for the hybrid vehicle over the lifetime emissions. Even without renewable fuels, we should still consider buying hybrids today if we want to impact climate change now. In the future, there will be conventional vehicles, hybrid vehicles, and electric vehicles where they make sense. The future is not just electric, the future is eclectic.
Okay, so yeah, he's pushing hybrid vehicles, and I think hybrid vehicles are fine. They're better than conventional vehicles for sure. But the assumptions that are made in his talk are taking, again, they're taking the best case scenario for internal combustion vehicles and using the worst case scenario for electric vehicles and comparing them to each other, which is a little disingenuous. So I will link all these studies below, and you can look at these and judge for yourself. If this is another guy talking about where the crossover point is, if you use the average American car and the typical EV, the crossover point here would be 20,000 miles. If you take into account the cost of production of gasoline as well. So this, if you look at, I guess the average American car is sort of the worst case scenario for an internal combustion vehicle. I mean, you could make it look a lot worse and just use like you know, like huge trucks or something as the comparison. But the average American vehicle is this, and the typical EV now in 2022 is like this. If you took the Aptera, it would probably start off a little higher than this, and it'd be much flatter than this. The crossover point would be, you know, well below 20,000 miles, and at its and a hybrid would probably look like this, right? So a hybrid doesn't really make sense if you care about CO2 production. And I think, yeah, in this graph, he's not even taking into account the cost of production. He's using the 404 grams per mile, which is this, and not even considering the cost of producing gasoline. But anyways, I hope that made sense to you guys. I know there's a lot of rambling and kind of my personal soapbox on a lot of things. If you didn't like it, please skip the video. We'll go get back to like strictly Aptera content. But someone requested I kind of give my thoughts on this, and I did have thoughts about it, so I wanted to make a video. Again, thanks to all of our sponsors. I really appreciate you guys, and thanks to you guys. If you toughed it out and watched this whole video, I appreciate you guys. Please comment what you think about the whole thing below, and have a great day, everyone.